Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about stratospheric ozone. Now, ozone can be found in both the troposphere and the stratosphere. In previous sections, we have talked about that tropospheric ozone, which is a product of photochemical smog, and it's something that is harmful to human health. Stratospheric ozone, on the other hand, is in that next higher layer of the atmosphere, and this is naturally occurring ozone, and this is what provides protection from the UVB and the UVC rays. You can see on this diagram that the light from the sun and that UV radiation, as it comes in through the atmosphere, it comes in those three forms, UVA, UVB, and UVC. Now, the ozone layer filters out all of the UVC, most of the UVB, and a little bit of the UVA. Now, this is important because exposure to UV radiation can lead to skin cancer, premature aging, cataracts, and eye damage, and it can even suppress the immune system. So how exactly does the stratospheric ozone do this? Well, it's a series of chemical reactions that are catalyzed by this UV radiation. And I have this diagram here, but I want to focus in on the actual chemical reactions. So ozone production is done in two steps. You have UV light splits regular atmospheric oxygen into two individual oxygen atoms. Then those oxygen atoms combine with a regular atmospheric O2 molecule to create O3, which is the ozone. So we're using or absorbing a little bit of that UV light to create the ozone. But ozone is naturally broken down as well, and there are three ways that this can happen. That UV light will split the ozone into regular free oxygen and O2 gas. You can also have one of those oxygen atoms combine with the ozone to create two molecules of O2 gas. Or you can have two ozone molecules react with each other to create three molecules of O2 gas. And again, these are natural processes, and within both the production and destruction of ozone, we are absorbing a little bit of that UV radiation. But we can deplete this ozone layer, and that can be depleted by natural factors and by anthropogenic factors. And again, we're focusing on that stratospheric ozone and not the ground level or tropospheric ozone. The natural way that ozone is destroyed is through what's called the Antarctic Spring. So Antarctic winters create these clouds full of ice crystals. And as those crystals melt in the beginning of springtime, some chemical reactions occur that convert the chlorine into a more reactive form. And that chlorine is going to react with the ozone to break down that ozone that's in the stratosphere. Now this, again, natural process, it occurs in Antarctic springtime, which is the fall in the northern hemisphere. But since this is a natural process, it tends to be reversed naturally as well. And the amount of ozone depletion from Antarctic spring should be able to be healed during that Antarctic summer and fall and winter. Now, humans are amplifying this ozone depletion by using what are called chlorofluorocarbons. Now, chlorofluorocarbons are CFCs. This is a chlorine with some fluorine attached and some chlorine attached. So we have our carbon base here. When the UV light hits our CFC molecule, it breaks off one of the chlorine atoms. Now that chlorine is going to react with the ozone and break that apart. So we're going to have that chlorine bind with the oxygen, and then we'll have an atmospheric oxygen or O2 molecule that gets released into the atmosphere. Now, that chlorine is not super stable there, and it can be easily broken off by having a free oxygen from in the atmosphere binding with the oxygen from the chlorine and the oxygen. and that chlorine can then go and attack another ozone molecule. So we're seeing this cyclic process where that chlorine is persistent in the atmosphere and it can be used over and over again. Now there are several sources of these chlorofluorocarbons, and they primarily come from aerosol sprays, solvents, and refrigerants such as Freon. And again, here's another way to look at that same diagram of seeing how those chlorofluorocarbons are reacting with the ozone, and that depletes the ozone layer. And because we are putting so many chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, scientists started to observe an ozone hole forming over Antarctica. Now again, naturally that ozone thins a little bit during Antarctic Spring, but we're not just seeing a thin ozone layer, we are seeing a non-existent ozone layer during parts of the year. And that ozone hole started to persist throughout the entire year and not just during the spring. So this was first observed in the 1970s, and this is amplified by the use of CFCs reacting with the ozone. And every year since it was observed, the size and duration of that ozone hole started to increase. And this was really concerning. So what happened was a group of nations from around the world got together in 1987 and created what's called the Montreal Protocol. And you do need to know this for the AP exam. So 27 nations got together and signed this agreement to phase out the production and consumption of substances that are responsible for ozone depletion, particularly those chlorofluorocarbons. Now, if all countries committed to these goals, that ozone layer would heal by the year 2050. So let's look to see how they did. We can see on this graph that the emissions of these chlorofluorocarbons and the ozone depleting molecules were declining pretty consistently up until the early 2000s. We can see that the reported production of these was essentially at zero, which was in accordance with the agreement. But then in the early 2000s, we started to see this increased. And that's because even though countries were reporting that they were not actually producing anything anymore, there were global air monitoring stations that were able to actually pinpoint to a factory, and I believe it was in northern China, that was still emitting these chlorofluorocarbons, even though it was part of the international agreement to no longer do so. So they were very quickly identified and shut down, and we are now back on track-ish to meet that goal by 2050. Because chlorofluorocarbons are important in terms of being used as solvents and refrigerants, we needed to find something to replace them with. And the first idea was to use what are called hydrofluorocarbons. And this was a pretty easy substitute, but we found out that this also damages the ozone layer, so they were pretty quickly phased out. Then, scientists developed hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Now the benefit here is that they do not have chlorine, so they do not directly impact that stratospheric ozone, but the drawback is they're absorbing some infrared radiation and they're contributing to the greenhouse effect. And we'll talk more about that in a subsequent video. Now these hydrofluorocarbons are likely going to be regulated under the Kyoto Protocol. Now this we'll talk about later when we talk about those greenhouse gases. Because the hydrofluorocarbons are not the best solution, I mean, they're the best we have right now, but they're not perfect. Scientists are still trying to develop better alternatives. So right now, at the moment, we're looking at potentially hydrofluoroethylenes, or HFOs, might be a better substitute for CFCs. But the problem is that these can break down and they become toxic to plants and soil organisms, so they require more research and they're not widely used yet. So our main replacement for CFCs are actually the HFCs. Now in summary, you should be able to explain the importance of stratospheric ozone to life on Earth. It blocks those harmful UV rays, but it can be damaged by anthropogenic factors such as the release of chlorofluorocarbons. And reducing that ozone layer means we're going to see more of those harmful effects from that UV radiation, such as increased rates of skin cancer and cataracts. You should also be able to describe some of the chemicals that are used to substitute for CFCs, particularly knowing that hydrofluorocarbons are our main substitute. They do not damage the ozone layer, but they are a potent greenhouse gas. Please leave your questions here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.